startups, a debate where we will take a closer look at how to create diversity and how this focus strengthens sustainable startups. My name is Muniza Rosendahl, and I have the great pleasure of moderating this debate with our super competent panel, which consists of Henriette Højberg, CEO at DareGender, Christian Balsig, Head of Public Relations, Press and Communications at DISIE, and Sara Louise Muhr, researcher at Copenhagen Business School. We know by now that diversity is a good investment as it gives companies a competitive advantage. However, a lot of companies still struggle when it comes to building a diverse group of employees, and there is still a lack of diversity when it comes to entrepreneurship as well as founders of startups. So how do we actually go about from saying that we want more diversity to actually doing it? And how should we think diversity? Is it more than just gender? We will dive into this and much more during this debate as we look at what we can do and must focus on to promote diversity in sustainable startups. So let's begin. And Sara, I'd like to start with you, as I know that you have written a book about gender in management, and we often see a binary gender angle when we talk about diversity. So my question for you is, could companies actually gain even more if they widen their scope to also include other criteria for diversity, for example, LGBT plus people or people of color?
The short answer is yes, obviously. The short answer is yes, but there is some problematic, or not problematic, but some challenges when you want to expand from gender to other categories. And first of all, that is, at least in Denmark, we can register and we can measure three categorization or categories, and that is gender, often a binary gender, by the way. It is gender, it is nationality, and it's age. It's one of those things we can measure, and that's the diversity aspect of it. If you want to think about, for example, LGBTQ or ethnicity, which has nothing to do with nationality, but we can get back to that a little later, then it's much more an inclusion approach. So if you want to take it very shortly, diversity is what we can measure, what we can count, and obviously we need diversity as well, and often it is the numbers that sets us off. It's the fundament for even addressing these issues. But inclusion has more to do with creating an inclusive workplace where everyone feels welcome. And here it's very tricky. For example, LGBTQ is not a visible category, so that gives us a lot of challenges in relation to how to do that. So for me, the reason why I'm here, I think, is also because I take a management approach. So it is very much a leadership responsibility of creating this culture in a manner which is inclusive for everyone and not, for example, forces people to come out at the workplace.
Thank you very much. And so, Sara, you've just told us that there are barriers. And Henriette, can you tell us more about these barriers when it comes to creating diversity within startups? Basically, why is it still so difficult?
Well, first of all, I think that we are dealing with a very stereotyping ideal of manhood. The young startup is a young male, he's white, he's in the beginning of his 20s, he works at least 80 hours per week. And this ideal or stereotyping is you're struggling if you're a woman or if you're a minority or an elder person who wants to be a startup. That's one thing. Another thing I think is also a challenge is that a lot of startups have been focusing on the product. How do you develop a specific product? And that has been a success. But many other startups today are focusing much more on impact, and that could also clash in this diversity agenda. So that is some of the barriers I see.
Thank you very much. And so we hear now that when we think about diversity, we also need to say inclusion. But I'd like to ask you, why could it also be important to take a more holistic approach when thinking about sustainability, and why could it actually be beneficial to link diversity to sustainability?
I would say in this, the short answer is actually that diversity brings more perspective to the table, and more perspective to the table can actually create better or bigger or better solutions. So that's the short answer. The longer one is that within startups, if you have more diversity on the team, lived experiences, your background, where you come from, etc., you are also creating a more broadening horizon to the rest of the team members. Not only when you want to create the solution, but also just in general as a good and great workspace.
Thank you. And so, Henriette, yes?
But I think that one of the barriers is that many startups, or at least that's what we have been experiencing when we have been talking to different startups, is, well, we are not against diversity or inclusion, but we don't think it's a necessary thing. Yeah. Or they say, well, you can just do it if you want to. So there is a clash between the gain you will reach and the fact that many startups do not include diversity. And I think that's a really big challenge.
Sarah?
But for me, just to pick up on where you left in my head, that's very much links back to the sustainability issue. Because for me, sustainability is not only Green Week, it's not only environmental kind of aspects, but it's very much also sustainability in relation to sustainable management. And if we think about startups, we also are addressing organizations that want some level of sustainability, possibly growth, possibly not, we don't know that. But if we want to look at the sustainability aspect, we also need to look at sustainable work cultures. And sustainable work cultures are cultures that not necessarily are diverse on very kind of nitty-gritty aspects, but are very much inclusive. And this is what links back to what you say, Henriette, that many organizations will say, oh, we're not against diversity, but they don't apply, for example. And that is why I always take this bias and stereotype approach. You said stereotypical masculinity. So there are many kind of stereotypes around how does an entrepreneur look like, also for the big venture capital firms. So when, for example, women or people of different ethnic backgrounds, they apply for funding, it is often a barrier in order to get funding because they don't look like an entrepreneur. And that doesn't have to be conscious. It's often unconscious biases that are at play here.
And we do know that it's only approximately 1% of female founders who will get investments. So we do have a problem, even though the amount of women or female startups are, I think it's 25%, but still 1% out of them gets the funding. So we do have a big issues. And that is only what is visible, as you said, regarding diversity. Yeah. So it is a problem we are dealing with. And I also think that the fact that we are focusing much more on the SDGs are actually a good way to promote diversity. Also in the you said sustainable management, I think that is a really good way to look at it. And also come across the barriers so we don't only look at diversity, but also have inclusiveness as part of the deal, so to speak.
And like?
Yeah, and I was saying in that way, another word for it could be that to find another word that call it the softer SDG goals. Yeah. Because it's not softer, it's just other goals, and to look at holistic way, because all goals bring a lot to the table, and we can create a better future if we look at it more broad. And I would say definitely within the startups, it's quite interesting, because here at DISIE we see that a lot of the founders from the startups are actually women. We have more than 50% when we do the yearly report on it. But they struggle when they get out in the real world, so to speak, and have to look for investors and funds, because they are also running into the barrier.
Yeah. And
Clara and then Henriette.
And this, for me, links very much the soft issues and the hard issues. And even though I, as you also insinuated, hate that division because they're so intertangled in the sense that the so-called soft issues are very much also an economic hard issue, because it's also about where we go as a country, how we also build our organizations. And if we only harvest a part of the talent that we have, we are in big trouble. And for me, that is very important in relation to how I always turn around the business case. Because when we talk about hard issues in economics here, often it is about, well, more women, more ethnic minorities, the diversity perspective, not the inclusion perspective, will increase performance, will increase earnings, etc. But that puts a lot of weight, a lot of emphasis on the minority, as if you put a woman into the team, suddenly that is the reason why performance increases. What we know is that the more diverse a team is, it's not that the woman comes with a different perspective necessarily, but it's much more that many in the team have different role models, different perspectives. Masculinity, by the way, is also broadening when we have various kinds of people. So both men and women, ethnic minorities, LGBT people, etc., will have many different ways of tapping into their resources. Because what for me is problematic today is that so many employees in all organizations, not just startups, they spend so much energy on performing what's expected of their body. So expected of masculinity, expected of femininity, expected of Danishness, whatever that is, etc., which means they don't focus on work. So it's only the bodies that are invisible in the workplace, and that is still often the male, white, heterosexual, middle-aged person coming from the CBS background from northern Copenhagen, etc. So there are many of these aspects because their bodies are never problematized, which means they don't have to deal with their bodies at the workplace. And that means they can work. So for me, these soft and hard issues are so intertangled, which is also why we need to intertangle diversity and inclusion perspectives.
Thank you. And Henriette?
Yes, my point was a little slightly
We agree
different.
way too much. It's not a panel.
Well, I'm very happy that we have a very lively panel, yes.
But I do think that I really agree on your points here, and to elaborate it on it, I think that the work culture is a way to put it in, and to focus on how do we create a work culture that is inclusive in many aspects, not just due to the minority markers, but in many ways. How do we have our work life balance? How many hours do we work a week, and so on? I think that is also a part of it. I do think that the challenge is, especially when we look at larger organizations, is that diversity and inclusiveness becomes a HR management issue. Yeah. And that does not solve anything. No. And I think that is really an issue we have to address in the future, that yes, you can have it there, but it has to be out there on the living floor. Yeah.
Sarah and
Just a very short comment on the HR, because I am a professor of HRM, so I have to do that. But a very short comment on that. It is so important. And so, for example, I teach a strategic HRM for MBA students, and it's very, very rare that there is an HR manager in that group. Maybe there's one. Mostly they're from sales or finance or marketing, etc. And I always start by asking them how many of them do HRM, and nobody says anything unless there is one person from HR. And then I say, well, what does HRM mean? It means the management of human resources. Yeah. Will you tell me that you don't manage human resources? And they all go, oh yeah, maybe, of course, all do. And then some of them say, but I don't have people responsibility. Well, don't you manage yourself, or don't we manage each other when we're here? You know, management is not just downwards, it's upwards, it's to the sides, etc. And with that perspective on management and HRM, everyone does it. Yeah. So that is also why it's so dangerous to park it in HR, because HR is often much more a support function in order for people to be able to manage people. Yeah. So that is why it has to be, founded in top management, of course, with the support of HR.
Thank you. Lai?
Yeah, I would just shortly say that it's not only about the CSR strategy, it's about the all the way around in the organization, the company, the startup, that you have to implement the diversity perspective, inclusive perspective, because you can't just do it in HR, as you say.
But can you tell us a bit more, because most companies, I think, and would think that, okay, it is within HR that you need to promote these ideas. Can you sort of elaborate on why it's important to have it also founded in the management? What does that sort of transcend into the company?
Well, nothing is legitimized if it doesn't come from top management. I mean, that's legitimization of the strategy. So, I mean, they would never implement a strategy which does not come from top management. So that's the basic answer. I mean, it needs legitimization. Otherwise, it's just, a support function.
Okay. Yeah. And so to come with some more sort of concrete examples, because again, a lot of people want to do diversity, but how do they actually go about it? So how do we promote, for example, a norm-critical approach?
Should I start?
Yeah.
Please.
So there are two aspects I work with when I work with organizations, small and large, and that is behavior and it's norms. And norms, that is the culture we work with, and that is super difficult. And every time I work with a group of managers and we say, okay, we have to work on the culture, it's like, because it's super, super difficult and it takes time. But you can do it. It doesn't mean you can't do it. And there are many, both books, guidelines, whatever. One of the really good ones is Inclusion Nudges. That's for free online by Tina Nilsson. And that is full of exercises that you can implement in your organization. So that is constantly being aware of what norms are we having in the organization. And that's very, very tightly linked to, for example, recruitment strategies. When I talk to recruiters or leaders and we talk about what is the perfect fit for the organization. So it has to be someone that feels right, But when it feels right, it's full of biases in relation to who fits this organization, which is both gendered, race, aged, etc. So for me, that's very much about trying to begin to question what is the ideal employee at our workplace? What does an IBMer look like? What does a Googler look like? What does a CBSer look like, etc. And that is a very difficult question to answer, but we all know. Okay, so it's something we all know. We have unconsciously built up this kind of stereotype, and that is also easy to, start to criticize. So a non-critical approach for me definitely starts with being more aware of what is the ideal employee here, and beginning to question which aspects of this ideal employee is important in order to have our culture, but which aspects can we also begin to question, criticize, develop, expand, etc. And it doesn't mean that we will then have no norms, because that's impossible. But it might mean we have more fluid norms or more transgressive norms, particularly when it comes to, for example, gender.
Thank you, Henriette.
I think that's some of the things that we have seen when we go about to basically male-dominated workplaces. We often see the resistance from the employees. And I think that one of the ways we are working with it is to include this resistance towards gender diversity or diversity in the large scale. Because many of these, the employees feel threatened about this new agenda and don't know how would this affect my life, my work life, my career opportunities and so on. So instead of saying you just have to accept it, we invite into a reflexive dialogue about why do you feel threatened and how can you deal with it in that sense. I think that is, we have success by doing that. Another thing that we are focusing on is in the work culture, and especially among the employees, is what kind of inclusive and exclusive mechanism is going about. Who's in the community and who's not. And you can also see that that could be turned up to gender and to LGBT and minority factors and so on. And we also look at the humor, especially in the Danish context. Humor and tone of voice at workplaces is really important in how you can create a more inclusive environment. And unfortunately, many workplaces are saying, well, if you don't like the smell, you just have to leave.
Yeah.
Or we went to a place, they said, well, here we don't like if humor cannot be high to the ceiling. And we were like, well, if high to the ceiling means that you are sexist, you're homophobic, and so on, is that a high ceiling?
Yeah.
So we also work with the humor as a way to create more awareness about how these more unconscious bias is affecting the culture in the workplace.
Yeah, and I would say from a startup perspective, it's also about looking into, as we talked about earlier, the stereotype of who's running a startup, who's the founder, what do an entrepreneur look like, how do they work, how many hours do they work, are they up 24/7, how's the work culture where they are, is it free, are they working during the night or meeting in early morning as the 8 to 4 job, or how does it look like that we look into. Is it accessible for all to attend this workplace, the startups? They looking into putting their best perspectives to the table or their best skills when they're trying to create a solution? Are they thinking outside the box? Because that's what many entrepreneurs are good at doing. So it's the norm criticism is not only about like the person, the people, the organization, how they recruit and manage, but also just basic how they doing their entrepreneurship.
Yeah. A very simple thing could, for example, be something like bias check your social activities. So if you start bias checking your social activities, maybe, I mean, I spoke to someone a few days ago that was before Corona. They were supposed to have a team meeting, and that was supposed to be in a spa. And that was, I think maybe there was one other woman, but there was also, maybe that's not the most inclusive kind of a thing to do, because there are many, and not only gender issues here, but many issues to why that is not okay on many levels. And her manager had never thought about it, because he just thought it would be nice, you know? So it's also just to think a second, what are your social activities? What's your Christmas lunch themes? I've been at so many organizations where they have to do sports in the breaks. So who can take part in these sports activities? What does the healthy body also means for a managerial or entrepreneurial ideal, etc. And that's fairly easy. And another easy thing is also representation. And I know you can't change people like this, but you can look at who do you invite to debates. I always joke a little bit about, I am an HRM or a leadership scholar. I do so many talks about diversity. I love them. I will not do them. But it's also, I'm not the one invited for leadership talks, for example. And I think that's quite interesting, because that is also my field. That's also what I teach. So it is one of those things like, who do you invite in? What do you have on your walls? We don't have much on the walls here. But what do you have on your walls? Yesterday I was in a room, in a boardroom, and there were, art on the walls, but then there was a statue in the corner, and that's an old white guy, dead probably. So it's also, you can choose that. That's not difficult to change. You can also change what you have in your communication folders, what you have, what expression you are also expressing through that. So that's the easy things.
But may I ask you, because Henriette, you were talking about this, that people can feel threatened. So, I mean, if we say that in a stereotypical sense, most will be white, heterosexual, cis males, how can we then promote these things of inclusiveness, instead of just saying that, oh, we now have a woman, we have a person of color?
I can give you an example of an exercise I always make. And now I hope that people that will then listen to my talks next week won't have a spoiler alert. But I always do an identity exercise. It's also, you can find it. I can sell the promotion right. cbs.dk/genderlab is free, so it's not really a promotion. But you can find these exercises in here. And it's an identity exercise where I first give my own identity categories. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it needs to get real, okay? So one of my points with norm criticism is this is about majority and not the minority. And the majority of the people I work with have never considered their whiteness, their cisness, their straightness, etc. So I start by giving my own categories, and I won't go into a long rant now, but I am a cis woman, and often when I say that in a group of directors from a normal standard company, they look like they have no idea what that thing is that's in front of cis, and then I start talking about, well, that has something to do with, when I was born, and the doctor gave me to my mother, and the doctor said, it's a girl. And I'm pretty comfortable with that. So then they begin to kind of consider that, and begin to consider that if I was not a cis woman, if I was a trans woman, I would have known very early. Okay? Then I'm white. I discovered very late I was white, and they usually laugh because I say it as a joke. And I say, but seriously, I did. I've never considered that. I have a bonus son who's half Moroccan. He knows he's not white. He's been told several times from he was very young. Then they think I'm married to a Moroccan man, and then it gets really interesting, because then I say I'm not Danish, I'm Austrian, but that's not a problem, because my Danishness is never contested. I speak very well Danish. I look Danish, okay? But if I haven't been white, that has been a problem. Then I'm a professor. That's sometimes really weird for people to understand when I look like this. And then I'm a mother of 3 boys. That fits very well with the way I look, but then I'm also a lesbian, which they then can't figure out because they thought I was married to a Moroccan man, okay? So that really kind of gives them some aspects to think about the visibility and the invisibility and what they thought about me when I enter the room and am on stage. And then I ask them to consider their own categories. And it's so difficult for them to write white, for example. It's so difficult for them to write straight. It's like it's an insult, or it's, you know, it's bad. And it's interesting because last time I did this, there was a CEO, and he was straight and white and male and cis and everything. And then his HR partner, and she was a woman of color, a female leader, and also a lesbian, which means she's kind of triple minority. And he was like, oh, this exercise is so difficult. Yeah. She just looked at him and said, no, it's not. And that is such an, great, and everyone can do that. You can do that in your own teams. So now it's out there.
Yeah, and I guess that's also, I mean, in this world where we all think about we want to be visible, that we actually forget the great privilege of being invisible.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Henriette, you had a comment?
Yes. When we also work critical with workplaces and firms, and we have developed a dilemma play, and we use it because often when you sit in these workshops with people, they know what is the right answer. They are trying to find out, what do you want me to say? Yeah. So I would say, diversity is a gain for this company. Duh. Then we sort of asking, okay, but how do you actually act? How do you behave on an everyday life in workplace situations? And then we have questions like, your good colleagues, he'll tell you that he's homosexual. How do you react?
That's okay.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
okay with that.
Yeah. Then we have one category saying, that's okay. I think it's really fine. I don't bother. And then we have an answer saying, that's okay, but does he have to show it? Or, I don't care. And the fact is that we have used this dilemma play to sort of broaden the colleagues' perspective on how they are biased. And they do say, that's okay, but does he have to show it? Yeah. That is a common answer. So it is something that we have to deal with and talk with. And we went to a place, and I love this story. It was a construction firm, and this guy, he was the head of a small group of employees, and one of his employees came up and said, my lover is going to come today. And then he was actually thinking, it's going to be a girl, she's going to be young, she's going to be white. And there came a guy. And he thought, it was his friend, and then he stepped out and he hugged him and kissed him. And the leader got so stressed that he turned around and walked away from the situation because he didn't know how to handle it. And he had never in his mind ever thought that he could be a homosexual man. And he was laughing while he was telling the story, but it was really clear to us that it was also a way of saying, I knew this was difficult, but now I have a way to tell it and to share it, because actually I don't think it was okay that I reacted that way, but I didn't know because we don't talk about it in this company. So that's how we work with it.
Thank you. And before I let you comment, Sara, I'd like to draw back, because now we've been talking about how to actually include people in companies, but what about startups? I mean, this is a long process. How do we actually promote people of different backgrounds to actually go into entrepreneurship or creating startups? Where do we start? Do we start when they graduate from university, when they get their first job, kindergarten?
I would say it's on several levels. It's not only about the startup itself, who's starting the startup, but it's also about the ecosystem around the startup. Are they capable, or are they okay and good at creating like an inclusive, diverse?
Can you elaborate on the ecosystem?
Yeah, like for instance, foundations. How do they judge when startups are applying for funds? Who's in the team of the fund team who is gonna approve or disapprove of the application? What are their criteria? What do they expect of the startup who's coming to pitch for them, etc. So that's like one part of it. It's also about including in networks. It can be difficult if you're, for instance, a minority starting a startup. How can you get into the network in the ecosystem if you're not a part of the student hub or have many friends who are already in this field? Yeah. And then there's the startup itself. How can we positive, tell better stories about how they develop, how they are scaling up, how they are creating an impact, and how can we bring the goods to the table about bringing different perspectives to the table? How can we say that lived experiences can be great in solving solutions?
And in that sense, it's no different in its basics from all organizations. And I think that's why we make so many parallels, because it is about the environment around. It's also about the universities. So, how is it that we at CBS, for example, have entrepreneurship clubs? I don't think it starts when they graduate. I don't even think it starts at university. It starts much earlier. So, for example, we know that within young girls, Denmark has the highest percentage of young girls who are interested in STEM subjects, but we have the lowest percentage of girls that can see themselves in a STEM kind of future. And I am pretty sure that if we make the same with entrepreneurship, that will be the same, because we also see pictures, we hear stories, you talk about the narratives, and that is everyone's responsibility, okay? So that is also a political responsibility, it's a university responsibility, it's a high school responsibility, it's a primary school responsibility, in order to broaden, again, the scope within which we see the entrepreneurs. So in that sense, we cannot put the pressure on entrepreneurs themselves, because then we go back to the argument you said, Henriette, where you said, oh, but why should we? I mean, why should I, as an entrepreneur with maybe 5 people in my organization, why does that matter to me? So we could run this, for example, with the funding bodies. That would be super interesting in relation to how do they actually give the funds. You had some very terrible statistics there in the beginning, and that's only the statistics we can measure.
Yeah,
okay?
Exactly. And I think that a way to sort of grab this agenda is to look at the investment funds. I think that they have a great responsibility in order to promote diversity. And I think that yesterday, or just a couple of days ago, I was talking to a bigger fund here in Denmark, and they have been data-driven, measuring the data from 2014 on diversity. And they have used this analysis in order to promote a more diverse field of applications, and also looking at the teams. And they have great results. They don't talk about it. And I was like, why don't you promote that you are actually doing this? And they were saying, nah, other people, we're not a forehead, the others are behind, And
that's the responsibility, I think, that everyone should take upon them, but especially the institutions like, for example, the funding bodies.
Yeah.
And if I can just add, because I wanted to add that before, I think we cannot stand here today and ignore the whole Me Too wave that's hitting us now, because this is also a huge problem in the entrepreneurship industry, particularly when it comes to funding.
Yeah.
So I have at least, and I don't have a study on this, but I've talked to many of the women entrepreneurs at my university, and they do experience some very, very harsh things when they look for funding.
Yeah.
So if they don't want to, join someone on the room, if they don't want to go for lunch, if they're not accepted, if they don't accept to be touched, etc., then they're not getting the money. So I think that what we're seeing unfolding now in so many other businesses, including my own, we really need to address when it comes to entrepreneurship as well, because that has something directly to do with the fact that women draw out, because that is just not something that you'll stand up for.
No. And I think that's really an issue that is not been enlightened enough. We don't have much data on it. We do have the narratives about it. And we can also see that when we have been out at businesses and that the women are really experiencing horrible things. Yeah. I was really shocked by the fact that one was telling us, well, I thought I was going to meet with an investor, and he thought it was a date.
Yes.
Or we went to this wine and dine. I don't like to drink. All the investors, they were drunk. How do I approach that? But also the work-life balance or the family does play a role also for women. I think that's quite interesting as well, because if you are a young woman and you're pregnant, for instance, then you also meet barriers. Because can you run a startup and having a small child, for instance?
But there's also young men who want children because they don't get they don't get leave at all. So I think it's a general problem. I mean, the maternity foundation and all of that.
This was one of some of the things that you were talking about when you were talking about a norm-critical approach. That it's not only the person, but it's also all the surroundings.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say to that, it's not only pregnant women, but also just young women who people expect to some way someday want to be pregnant and carry a child. So it's that the barrier as well, and a norm or understanding.
And if you don't want children as a woman, you're also weird. So it's a lose-lose.
Yeah.
So this might be a sort of very, some would might say a stupid question, but can we actually change this? Because when we're talking about Me Too and sexism and everything, we're talking about power. The people in power, for the most part, are white, middle-aged, heterosexual, cis men. Can we then actually change all of these things if they want to keep on holding tight to this culture that we see now?
They're not one group. So they are not one group either. I think that first step is we shouldn't say they, because then it becomes, and I know you don't mean that, but so maybe you provoke this answer. So that we don't put up a fight between those white, straight, middle-aged men that is one big mass, and then the rest of us that has our diversity in every aspect. So I think we need to get, first of all, out of that, and also look at, you said that earlier as well, Henriette, is very often that the majority of they actually do not appreciate that masculine culture that's going on. But that is also reinforced through norms, through jokes, through humor, through we've always done so. And especially in the Me Too wave we see now, I think what is very interesting is not only the person that is committing it or the victim, but is also the big mass that is silent, both men and women and of whatever color and sexuality, whatever. So I think it's also about that these days we're getting a lot of stories and narratives which makes it more okay to say no. And also more okay to say, this is not a workplace culture that I am interested in. Of course there are people who are interested in keeping this power, but I do think that's a minority. I mean, I work with a lot of established organizations, and it's very rare I meet someone who's not generally interested in changing it. They don't know how to, but that is what we do when we go and play dilemma games or these different types of exercises with them, is to consider and reflect on their own majority status and what they can do from their majority status, and that is not only about the minority, but it's also doing it for themselves. Because I think it's very important that they don't do it for us, because they do it for themselves as well. Because otherwise it becomes a helping discourse, and then we're already starting from a different point. They do it for themselves as well, because very few people actually like to work in a culture that is, sexist or excluding, etc.
Yes, I think that one of the things that I think could be a way of going as well. Now we look really internal at companies and startups and workplaces, but I also think that this impact agenda can move forward on this agenda. And I think that could also, if we are having more startups with the focus on impact and not so much on the product, I think that could also be a changeable in this direction.
And last comment from you guys.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely about the impact. It's about going to the purpose-driven people within every sector and across the sectors, and create partnerships across the sectors to work together on how can we best, what's the best practice here, how can we deal with it, how can we work with it, how can we implement. So it's not only in one sector or in the startup itself, it's everywhere. For instance, the foundations, that's a good example for a best practice. Then let us work on it to create it everywhere.
And on that note, thank you so much. Thank you. So what we can think about going from this debate is that norm critique is not only about behavior, it's also about these activities and the whole ecosystem surrounding the startups. And we have to think about that it's not, it's about the majority and not the minority. And we have to be aware of our own biases. And it's also really important that all of us, we create positive stories and narratives while also keeping in mind that there are problem issues that we need to address. For example, Me Too issues and sexism. And I think that I'll wrap this debate up by saying that we should all do it for ourselves.
Yes.
So on that note, I will say thank you so much for joining this debate. Thank you to the awesome panel, and have a good day.